what is likely to be the final proper entry into a franchise that helped shape the video game industry in terms of storytelling, theming, and scale. Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain is one of the most fascinating games to have ever been released, not only due to how disjointed yet addictive the title feels, but also because of the tumultuous circumstances surrounding its development, and the subsequent falling out between series creator Hideo Kojima and the series publisher Konami. The Metal Gear saga has become one of the most influential and venerated franchises in all of video games. Taking a subversive approach to game design, Hideo Kojima is well known for weaving cerebral and deeply complex narratives into his games that work in not only entertaining and touching players, but also in alienating and confounding them by the very same token. This is a series that has always been at the forefront of technology and game design and practically revels in destroying player expectations through fourth wall breaks, plot twists, and boss battles that are memorable, challenging, and deeply rewarding. While Metal Gear has likely become most well known for its propensity for long and sometimes drawn out cutscenes, it is the vast array of interesting and fully fleshed out characters that has allowed the franchise to remain such a consistent illustration of quality and intrigue since its inception. The saga is brimming with characters who are complex and layered, placed into grandiose circumstances that players are allowed to take part of. The richness of the world that these characters inhabit is captivating and pronounced just enough to blur the lines between fiction and non-fiction. The themes of the series consistently delve into the ways in which human identity can be shaped, from their very genetic structure in the original Metal Gear Solid, to their environments in Metal Gear Solid 3, to how their perceived realities will influence future generations in Metal Gear Solid 4, and how that reality can be warped in Metal Gear Solid 2. This overarching and intricate focus on theme, character, player expectation, game mechanics, and game design all work in accordance to push the series beyond the scope of what many thought a simple video game franchise could be capable of. It is this prestigious legacy that Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain has both triumphed and failed to live up to, as The Phantom Pain is poignant and emotionally charged, and delineates its overall themes excellently. However, unlike its progenitors, it does so to the detriment of the entire experience. It feels as though The Phantom Pain desperately wants to delve into how a thirst for revenge can destroy not only individuals, but nations and races. However, the game merely introduces these concepts and leaves them in the ether without fully developing them. The themes end up coming across as mere affectations that are vaguely relevant to the task that players are allowed to undertake, and work in making the story overall feel hollow, inchoate, and insignificant when compared to the rest of the franchise. It's difficult to discern whether or not this lack of narrative cohesion was a conscious choice on the developer's part, or simply a symptom of time constraints and deadlines, because the feelings that are elicited through its muddled and sometimes clumsily delivered narrative perfectly conform to the concept of a phantom pain. Nonetheless, many of the concepts that Kojima wanted to delve into, such as the nature of language, in-group out-group dynamics, and the truth behind legends, are painfully underdeveloped. However, to a certain extent, the Phantom Pain does succeed at specifically tackling the notion of legends. Throughout the franchise, Solid Snake and Big Boss had become legends not only in their respective fictional universe, but also in ours. Many gamers see these characters as larger-than-life heroes who can make the impossible possible, and since much of our understanding of these characters is delivered to us in the form of codec conversations, impressive set pieces, and stories of their countless triumphs in the face of incredible odds, we ourselves have idealized these characters to a certain extent, and rightfully so. Throughout the series, both Big Boss and Solid Snake are uneasy about how others perceive them. The legend of Solid Snake of Shadow Moses, the legend of Big Boss of Operation Snake Eater. While these characters have indeed overcome incredible odds, they understood that they didn't achieve these ends alone. They weren't one-man armies, and they were simply soldiers doing what was asked of them. Their achievements were romanticized with every retelling, their intentions were misunderstood, and their legends were propagated against their wills for insidious purposes. By delving into the truth behind the legend of Big Boss, Kojima attempted to punctuate this point by elucidating the fact that the reality is no match for the legend. This decision is paradoxically compelling whilst remaining deeply disappointing because in spite of the clever subversion that the narrative attempts to achieve, it isn't delivered well enough to constitute any true change in perspective in regards to legends and what the truth may or may not be. The Phantom Pain's big reveal comes off as heavy-handed and listless because of how dishearteningly underdeveloped developed the narrative ends up being. The truth behind Punish Snake and Big Boss should have been akin to the elucidation of the S3 plan at the end of Metal Gear Solid 2, but instead of completely shattering our preconceived notions of what it means to be a hero and a legend, the Phantom Pain simply attempts to retread concepts that Metal Gear Solid 2 already masterfully portrayed and comes off as a far lesser game because of it. While the nature of legends is perhaps the strongest piece of storytelling weaved into the Phantom Pain's narrative, there are plenty of other intriguing ideas presented about the nature of words and their connections to identity, ideology, nationality, and culture, and how they may be used to completely erase not only entire groups, but an individual sense of self. What would it mean to lose your mother tongue? How does your mother tongue shape your identity? Can a language be toxic? Can words destroy? There's also the persistent theme of how power should and shouldn't be used, and how others perceive that usage of power. The game applies some provocative imagery to outline its themes through homages to popular works of fiction such as William Golding's Lord of the Flies and George Orwell's 1984. Much like the various concepts and themes that the game attempts to comment upon, these interesting references end up being little more than vacuous allusions to stories with much more profound and passionate things to say about the human condition than the Phantom Pain ever comes near addressing. There seems to be a schematic for an interesting story here that the developers failed to realize properly due to a drastic change in direction, tone, and design. This jarring change in presentation is in direct contrast to how prior games in the series delivered their narratives with rich and highly stylized cutscenes, codec conversations, and plots that make the Phantom Pain feel unbelievably lifeless and barren by comparison. After the extravagant and excellently paced introduction, the story sequences are very few and far between, and while this may not be an issue for players who are just getting into the franchise, longtime fans will likely find this to be a detrimental betrayal of the spirit of the series, as this is a franchise that has consistently been one of the most important, resonant, and influential in the industry in regards to storytelling. Once the story takes a back seat to the addictive yet relatively shallow game design, one can't help but feel that the Phantom Pain is lacking in the most integral facet of the series, its identity. Exacerbating this issue even further is how void of personality and charm the characters themselves are written, and of how little importance the plot turns out to be in the grand scheme of things. The Phantom Pain was supposed to close loose plot threads and conclude the franchise once and for all, but instead actually raises more questions than it answers, and feels incomplete, unsatisfying, and disappointing from a thematic standpoint. The overall brevity and lack of clarity in regards to the story are likely Kojima's direct response to understandable complaints about how long and drawn out certain cutscenes and codec conversations could be in some of the prior titles in the series. However, to completely expunge such an elemental facet of the franchise in favor of sterile audio logs, underutilized characters, and an inconsequential plot was careless and myopic, to put it lightly. We learn next to nothing about Venom Snake as a character who feels much more like a blank slate or a player avatar than a fully formed and intriguing person. Even during cutscenes, Snake rarely utters a word, which is a crying shame because whenever we do hear him speak, the new voice of Big Boss, Kiefer Sutherland, does an excellent job encapsulating the character with a genuine, stern, and captivating performance. The majority of the returning cast have been stripped of their personalities, as it seems as though the characters merely pantomime the attributes that they are known for, as opposed to exhibiting these characteristics as an extension of themselves and their personas. For example, Miller quickly becomes a one-note character with a chip on his shoulder and lust for revenge. Huey Emmerich becomes a duplicitous maniac hell-bent on self-preservation. Revolver Ocelot, who was one of, if not the most interesting character in the entire franchise, has somehow become diluted to the point where he's the voice of reason at Mother Base. And even Skullface, who once came across as intimidating, scrupulous, and abhorrent, becomes little more than a comic book villain who goes off on one of the most awkwardly conceived monologues that I've ever witnessed in a video game. The character who is most successfully realized in the game is Quiet, who easily illustrates all the qualities that most of the best MGS characters are known for, just through her actions alone. Even though the Phantom Pain story is deeply disjointed, obtuse, and disappointing, where the game truly shines is through its impressive presentation and core set of mechanics. The Phantom Pain takes place in an expansive and impressive open world which allows players to trek to objective points, scout out enemy bases, and tactically create infiltration methods and strategies that are unique and tailored to their specific playstyles. The number of options players are given initially are limited so as to allow the experience to unravel itself at a steady pace, permitting players to slowly familiarize themselves with Snake's new abilities such as sprinting, diving, rolling while prone, and tagging enemies, items, and vehicles. The core set of mechanics, which are built upon the open-ended nature of the mission structures, places player choice at the forefront of the experience, for better or worse, because while the number of ways Snake can tackle any given mission are expansive, the repetitive nature of the overall game design works to dilute this system, which is brimming with far more potential than it manages to achieve. In many ways, The Phantom Pain feels like a direct sequel to Peace Walker because the vast majority of mechanics that were introduced in Peace Walker have either been expanded upon or streamlined in one way or another in The Phantom Pain. Much akin to Peace Walker, players are allowed to abduct enemy combatants and recruit them to expand Mother Base, which works as the game's central hub, where items, materials, weapons, and vehicles can be researched and developed to give Snake an expansive palette of gameplay styles to experiment with. As players recruit more soldiers, they will be allowed to expand Mother Base, which will go from a small settlement to an expansive base which houses all forms of deadly weaponry, vehicles, and even animals. The augmentation of Mother Base over the course of the game is satisfying and addictive initially, as investing resources properly and recruiting highly skilled soldiers allows for a number of development opportunities which directly benefits players, allowing access to even more varied weapons and items to tackle missions with. The Phantom Pain does an excellent job at rewarding player experimentation and goes out of its way to coax players to switch up their playstyles by having enemy combatants react to techniques that are used too often by players. For example, if you're the kind of player who enjoys scouting out a base and picking off enemies one by one with your sniper rifle, future bases that you attempt to infiltrate will contain enemy snipers as well as soldiers adorned in brand new gear to withstand rifle fire. Consequently, if you decide to switch things up by going into bases with your tranquilizer pistol and getting headshots, in future missions enemies will begin wearing helmets so as to counter your method of play, making you rethink your approach so as not to make the gameplay feel stale or formulaic. In spite of the interesting dynamic that this creates between players and AI, the reactionary AI can actually be circumvented by taking part in Outer Ops. Outer Ops allows players to form teams of recruits from Mother Base to go out on various missions in the pursuit of expanding Mother Base even further. These missions include finding brand new recruits, protecting territories, gathering items, and yes, even destroying weapons caches that allow the AI to react to your tailored playstyle. If you aren't fond of your methods being hindered by the reactionary enemy AI, you can destroy their access to the items that they need to counter you through these Outer Ops, and continue playing the Phantom Pain in the way that's most satisfying for you specifically. The number of options that players are given to complete missions are innumerable. This becomes especially apparent if you decide to go back and replay some of the earlier missions for the hidden objectives and higher mission rankings. Going back through earlier missions with the much more advanced technology provided by Mother Base opens up myriads of possibilities that couldn't even be considered during initial runs. In this way, the Phantom Pain is perhaps the most expansive and mechanically nuanced Metal Gear title in the franchise. The Phantom Pain even gives players access to combat buddies who can actually help Snake clear missions and complete objectives in novel and interesting ways. There are 4 combat buddies in total, each with their own specific set of strengths and weaknesses, which tend to make overall completion of missions much easier than playing through them solo. For example, D-Dog is a buddy who will point out objects of note to Snake, such as enemy combatants, animals, plants, and even items. While D-Dog is active, there's little to no need for Snake to manually tag enemies because D-Dog will point them out as Snake traverses environments, and can even sniff out enemies who are in buildings and hidden in unorthodox places to make the gaming experience feel much more streamlined and congenial. The caveat with these combat buddies is that only one can be selected at a time, so while selecting D-Dog allows Snake access to his omniscience, Snake won't be able to traverse environments as quickly as he would had he chosen D-Horse or D-Walker. Each of the buddies allows for even more options on top of an already layered set of game mechanics, and while some of the buddies are far more useful than others, they're all worth experimenting with to get the most out of the experience. While the Phantom Pain's biggest strength as a game is its ability to take a step back and allow players to experiment with a vast set of options and mechanics unencumbered, where the game truly falters is in contextualizing these mechanics in varied and interesting ways so as not to allow the gameplay to become dull and monotonous. Because the narrative so quickly fades into the background, the game attempts to create impetus within players through the development and creation of brand new items and weapons. This means of progression works well in the early stages of the game when completing objectives, recruiting soldiers, and managing Mother Base is simple and effective. However, as the game progresses, the amount of time and resources needed in order to do something as simple as create a new weapon increases to an almost ludicrous degree. This means of padding out the game feels cheap, artificial, and grating by the time the experience has come to a close. The forced grinding and disregard for player time is almost insulting, as the fatigue from repeating the same exact missions assiduously and waiting perpetually for new weapons to develop sets in. Exacerbating this issue even further is the fact that Mother Base itself is completely bereft of a heart, soul, or personality of its own. Expanding the base during a playthrough is initially impressive as the soldiers that have been recruited begin to patrol the struts, and brand new structures go under construction with the increase of materials and manpower you've managed to build up. Nonetheless, as time progresses, you'll come to find that there's nothing of actual substance to take part in at Mother Base. It's a lifeless shell of a camp that contains only one or two brilliant moments that give players a glimpse into what could have been had the developers decided to flesh it out further. The Phantom Pain's mission structure is perhaps its most substantial failure, as the story missions themselves have little to no narrative cohesion whatsoever. It's a difficult task to become invested in the already scarce narrative that the Phantom Pain pieces together, so when the actual missions themselves aren't tailored very well to the overall arc that's being presented, any sense of immersion atrophies. This is where the flaws in the game design become most apparent, because in order to progress in the Phantom Pain, players are forced to do side missions with repeating objectives assiduously. These missions are ostensibly fun the first few times through, but they quickly become monotonous. After destroying the tank unit for the 7th time, or extracting the 12th highly skilled target, it's hard not to feel like the game is merely padding out its length. The impressive open world that the designers have done an excellent job of creating is visually impressive, detailed, and beautiful to look at. However, it adds almost nothing to the core gameplay beyond the fact that players are now allowed to traverse entire environments in order to get to enemy bases and missions. All of the time and effort that went into crafting these expansive environments were to the game's overall detriment, because the level design in the Phantom Pain is basic, unimpressive, and disappointing. There aren't any areas as memorable as Shadow Moses Island from Metal Gear Solid 1 or the Tanker from Metal Gear Solid 2, and the fact that there are only 2 maps to explore, which are completely void of story-specific environments, NPCs to talk to, or hidden items and scenarios to find, makes for a game world that is as vast and impressive as it is barren and inert. Being forced to traverse such an expansive environment in order to get from mission to mission quickly becomes an absolute chore. Even with the help of the support chopper that you have access to, it takes far too long to get to missions that should have been easily accessible to players at all times. The open world comes across as little more than a novelty than an actual integral component of the game design. Frankly, if the game had dropped the entire idea of an open world, the Phantom Pain would likely have been a far more focused and enjoyable experience overall. The designers have done little to nothing with the open world from a practical perspective to warrant its inclusion in the game, and have essentially built an environment specifically for players to waste their time in. In this way, the Phantom Pain's failures at game design reflect its disappointing narrative structure almost perfectly. It's filled with impressive and interesting ideas that aren't developed fully, and has attempted to fuse these ideas together lackadaisically in an ineffectual effort to become much more than some of its parts. The ideas that the title introduces to the franchise are enough to stand on their own to make a good video game, but the Metal Gear Solid franchise is venerated in this medium for its excellence, not for its mere adequacy. The story missions are lacking in any sense of urgency or focus, the game design is bereft of any set pieces or truly intricate and engaging locales, the overt absence of memorable boss battles, which is one of the staples of the entire series, is truly a disservice that cannot be overlooked, and the repetitive mission structure makes the Phantom Pain feel much more like a time sink than an immersive and memorable experience. Overall, Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain is a title of deep contrast that fails to live up to its full potential due to myopic and quizzical design decisions. Perhaps the most disheartening aspect of The Phantom Pain is how masterfully it exhibits all of the elements needed to create an amazing experience, whilst collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. It successfully implements many of the more popular mechanics of the current AAA gaming industry, from regenerating health to an open world structure and even microtransactions. However, the application of these shallow design elements came at a cost, as the Phantom Pain is overtly lacking in any sort of identity of its own. Nonetheless, this isn't to say that the Phantom Pain isn't enjoyable as a standalone title. The game is brimming with content and is highly replayable. Creating new strategies to tackle missions with and experimenting with the vast array of weapons and items will keep you entertained for hours on end. If you are a fan of stealth, action, or open world games, you'll no doubt have plenty of fun with everything the Phantom Pain allows you to do. Interestingly, the Phantom Pain is perhaps the most rich Metal Gear title in the entire franchise in terms of content, yet still somehow manages to feel the most incomplete and disappointing. We may never know whether or not the Phantom Pain was developed specifically to elicit a feeling of loss within players, or if the developers simply didn't have enough time to bring their vision to fruition, but whatever the case may be, the Phantom Pain is a far worse game because of it. It's rather poetic that the franchise would conclude on such a somber note. The game feels as though it's missing a vital portion of its structure, merely giving you a glimpse into its inner workings without revealing its true intentions. It elicits a deep sense of loss and works as almost a requiem for the franchise in its entirety. This is the final Metal Gear Solid game developed, written, and directed by its series creator, Hideo Kojima, and while the game doesn't go out with the bang that many of us had hoped for, the realization that this is truly the end of this iconic franchise has effectively inflicted a phantom pain that many of us may never truly recover from.